The wind swept over the prairie with a restless hand, carrying dust and the scent of sage that seemed to cling to everything in Redemption Creek. The year was 1889, and the small town crouched against the horizon like a stubborn outpost refusing to disappear. Its main street was a strip of dirt and shadows lined with a saloon, a general store, and a courthouse that looked more like a barn than a hall of justice. It was a place where survival meant compromise, where pride was traded as often as cattle, and where reputations stuck harder than the mud after spring rain. Into this town rode Jonah Hale, a rancher whose name carried weight across the county. He had money, cattle, and land enough to make others bow their heads, but his heart was a stone. No one seemed able to move. He was 36 tall and lean, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a presence that drew attention, whether he wanted it or not. Men respected him. Women kept their distance, and children whispered about the stories they heard of him in the dark. On this day, the town buzzed with a different kind of energy, the kind that left stomachs tight and voices sharp. An auction was set to take place, one of those grim spectacles where widows or abandoned women were put up before the crowd, their futures bargained for in dollars and shame. The judge, a man whose gavel struck faster than his conscience, had announced it earlier in the week. Wagons from the countryside rolled in, men with coin jangling in their pockets, laughter and whispers spreading like wildfire. No one admitted enjoying it, but they came all the same. Jonah told himself he would watch only, not participate. He had no need for a wife bought in public, no desire for complication. His ranch was enough, his solitude, his shield. But the prairie had a way of bending even the strongest resolutions. The saloon spilled rough voices into the street as the hour drew near. Men were already drinking and placing bets about which woman would fetch the highest price. Jonah leaned against a post outside, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching dust rise as the auction block was dragged into place. Faces familiar to him appeared in the crowd, and he nodded without speaking. Survival here did not allow for too much friendliness. When the women were brought out, a hush settled over the gathering. Some stood bowed and trembling, some held children by their skirts. Some stared at the ground as if the earth might open and swallow them whole. It was a cruel ritual, one Jonah had avoided for years, and then she appeared. A woman dressed in black from head to toe, a veil covering her face, gloves hiding her hands. She moved not like a broken soul, but like a statue carved from grief and pride. The crowd stirred, muttering. Questions flew from rough lips. Who was she? Why hide her face? What did she conceal beneath the dark cloth? Even the judge faltered before regaining his voice, declaring she was educated, literate, and able to manage a household. Her name, he said, would be given only after the auction ended. The men jeered, suspicion curdling into cruelty. Ugly as sin, some shouted. Diseased, others sneered. But Jonah felt something shift in him, a pull he could not name. He moved through the crowd before he realized his own legs carried him. When the judge called for bids, silence followed, no man willing to risk his coin on a mystery. Her gloved hands trembled once the first crack in her stillness. And then, as if fate had sharpened its knife, a rival stepped forward. Elias Mercer, a rancher with more taste for whiskey than cattle, called out across the crowd, challenging Jonah with a wager. The words were cruel, mocking, daring him to claim the veiled widow and prove his manhood by dawn. Laughter rolled through the men, sharp and mean. Jonah's pride flared like dry grass under a match. He knew better, knew the trap, but pride had been his companion longer than reason. 50, Jonah said, his voice carrying steady. The judge's gavel fell quickly, relieved to be done with the discomfort. The woman in black was his. Jonah stepped onto the platform and held out his hand. She hesitated, then placed her gloved fingers in his palm, trembling though she held herself tall. When she spoke, her voice was low but clear, the sound of someone who had carried too much sorrow. "My name is Eliza," she whispered, Eliza Warren. Jonah felt the weight of every eye in town as he helped her down, the bet still burning in the air, and the road ahead turning darker than he had imagined. The wagon wheels creaked as Jonah guided the team of horses out of Redemption Creek. Behind them, the town faded into the haze of dust, voices echoing faintly before the prairie swallowed them whole. Eliza sat beside him, her veil fluttering in the wind, her posture stiff as iron, though her hands clutched at her lap like someone bracing for impact. Jonah kept his eyes on the trail, the reins firm in his hands, but his mind turned in restless circles. He had not planned this, had not wanted it yet. Here she was, a stranger bound to his ranch by the stroke of a gavel and the cruelty of men's laughter. The Double H Ranch rose out of the horizon like a promise and a warning. It was a place Jonah had built with sweat and stubbornness, 2 stories of timber with a wraparound porch, barns stretching wide, fences running like scars across the land. Cattle dotted the fields, their low calls blending with the sigh of the wind. As they approached, the lanterns glowed in the windows, warm against the coming dark. Jonah stole a glance at Eliza. She had not spoken since giving her name. The black veil still shielded her face, leaving him with nothing but the outline of her grief. Inside the house, the air carried the faint scent of oak smoke and leather. Jonah set down her small bag by the stairs. "This is your home now," he said, the words heavy in his throat. Eliza's reply was quiet, almost brittle. "A house is not always a home, Mr. Hale." Her tone struck him harder than a blow, for it carried a truth he had long ignored. He nodded, showing her the room at the top of the stairs, the one with lace curtains his mother had once chosen. She paused in the doorway, her gloved hands tightening as though she held back words that would not come. "Thank you," she whispered before stepping inside. Jonah left her there, closing the door softly behind him, but Buck Mercer's mocking voice still rang in his ears. That night, Jonah sat at his kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey. The fire burned low in the hearth shadows, bending long across the walls. He thought of Eliza upstairs, of the tremor in her hands, of the secret she hid beneath the veil. Pride had driven him into this, pride and the need to silence the laughter of men. But now it was more than a wager. He felt it in the tightness of his chest, in the unease that refused to let him rest. When he finally climbed into his bed, sleep did not come. The ticking of the old clock marked each hour, each reminder that dawn would bring questions he could not yet answer. Morning light poured gold across the land. Jonah saddled his horse and rode the range, letting the work steady his thoughts. Cattle moved slow in the pasture, the sound of hooves and lowing calming the storm inside him. But when he returned, he found Eliza standing in the garden near the house. She was still cloaked in black veil, drawn hands clasped as though in prayer. The sight stopped him. She looked less like a widow purchased at auction, and more like a figure carved out of sorrow and resilience. Morning, Jonah called, dismounting. She inclined her head but did not meet his eyes. He studied her a moment, then said, "Folks are curious about you." A widow showing up without a name stirs questions. Her gloved hands tightened, her voice cool but edged with pain. "I prefer not to speak of the past." Jonah frowned. "You'll find the past has a way of following a person out here." For the first time, she turned fully toward him. Even through the veil, he felt her gaze pierce him, sharp and unyielding. "Then perhaps it is best you do not ask." Her tone silenced him in a way few men had managed. That evening, Tom Brennan, Jonah's foreman, arrived with news. He set his hat on the table, his face grim. "Buck Mercer's been running his mouth all over town. Says you bought the widow on a dare. Folks are taking bets now, Jonah. They're waiting to see if you prove yourself or crawl away in shame." Jonah's jaw tightened. Before he could speak, Eliza entered, carrying a tray of tea she had made herself. Her hands trembled so badly the cups rattled against the porcelain. "A bet?" she asked, her voice low, barely more than a breath. Tom shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had said too much. Her eyes fixed on Jonah, though the veil still covered her face. He felt the weight of her stare like fire against his skin. "Is it true?" she demanded. The silence stretched heavy. Jonah wanted to deny it to protect her from the humiliation, but the truth clung to him like mud he could not scrape away. "Yes," he admitted at last, his voice rough. The tray clattered as Eliza set it down, her shoulders stiff. "So I am nothing but a wager to you, a game among men." Jonah stepped forward, his chest tight. "It isn't like that." "Then tell me what it is." "Mr. Hale," she said sharply, "because I came into this house thinking perhaps it might offer a chance for dignity. But if I am here only because of a drunken bet, then I am no better than cattle on the block." Her voice cracked, but her spine held straight. Jonah reached for her arm, desperate to explain, but she pulled back, retreating up the stairs, the whisper of her black dress trailing behind. He stood frozen in the kitchen, shame twisting in his gut. Tom exhaled slowly. "You've stepped in deep this time, Jonah." That night, as Jonah lay awake listening to the storm gathering outside, one thought consumed him. The veil. What truth did Eliza Warren hide beneath it? And what secret could wound her more deeply than the betrayal she had just endured? The storm pressed against the windows all night, rattling shutters and sweeping dust through the cracks. Jonah lay awake staring at the dark ceiling beams, his fists clenched at his sides. He could not silence Eliza's words the way her voice cracked when she called herself no better than cattle. Shame crawled over his skin thicker than sweat. By dawn, his eyes burned from sleeplessness. A soft knock broke the silence. Jonah swung his legs to the floor, the boards cold under his feet. "Come in," he called, now his voice was hoarse. The door creaked and Eliza stepped inside. She was still cloaked in black veil, drawn, her posture stiff but trembling. She paused by the threshold as though weighing whether to step further. Finally, she closed the door behind her and faced him. "I will not waste your time, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice low but steady. "This wager of yours, it haunts me. I cannot stay in a house built on shame. So let me end it tonight." Jonah shot to his feet, heart hammering. "You don't have to prove anything." But Eliza was already lifting her hands to the veil. The pins came free one by one, each falling like a nail into the silence. The heavy cloth slipped away, revealing a thinner mesh beneath. Her hands shook but did not stop. "My husband and child died in fire," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. "I lived, if this can be called living." With a final motion, she pulled the last veil aside. Jonah froze. Where soft hair should have framed her face was a scarred scalp. Patches of smooth skin were marred by fire's cruel hand. Her cheek bore ridges twisted by flame, her lips trembling against the weight of memory. But her eyes, gray as storm clouds, fierce with grief and defiance, held him captive. She lifted her chin, though her hands still trembled. "This is the truth," she said. "This is what your town would call a horror. This is what your Buck Mercer paid to see. So now, sir, collect your winnings." The silence after her words was heavier than gun smoke after battle. Jonah stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate, until he stood so near he could see the freckles that had survived the fire scattered across her scarred cheek. "No," he said, voice rough, unsteady, but full of conviction. "Watson wagered on shame. But there is no shame here. You stood through fire and loss, and you are still standing stronger than most men I've known." Eliza searched his face, waiting for the recoil, the disgust, the cruel laugh she had grown used to. None came. Instead, Jonah raised his hand steady despite his racing heart and touched her cheek with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. Her lips parted, her breath uneven. "You asked if you were cursed," he continued softly. "I'll tell you plain. You are not cursed, Eliza. You are a miracle." His words were raw, stripped of pride and stubbornness. She stared at him, eyes shining in the dim lamplight, and for the first time in many months, her composure broke. A single tear traced the line of her scar falling onto his hand. Thunder growled beyond the walls, but inside the room the storm quieted. Jonah drew a breath heavy with the weight of choice. "Tomorrow when Buck Mercer comes sniffing for his entertainment, I'll pay him every cent. I'll tell him I lost the bet. Because the truth of you stays with me and no man has the right to use it for sport." Eliza blinked, startled. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jonah's answer was simple. "Because I see you. Not what you lost, not what the fire took. You." The words hung in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. Eliza lowered her gaze, her scarred hands twisting together as if afraid to let hope take root. Jonah felt something shift inside him, something long buried beneath years of pride and solitude. He realized that what had begun as a bet, a cruel game forced upon him, had become something far different. He had not chosen Eliza Warren. But standing there in the fragile space between shame and acceptance, he knew she might be the one choice that mattered more than land, cattle, or pride. Morning came with a sharp chill, the kind that made the prairie grass bow low and the cattle huddle close. Jonah was already outside before the sun had climbed past the horizon, splitting logs with a force that betrayed the storm inside him. Every strike of the axe echoed his thoughts. Buck Mercer's jeers, Eliza's trembling voice, the veil dropping away to reveal the scars she thought would damn her. Each memory tightened his jaw until his teeth ached. Inside the house, Eliza moved quietly. She had tied her veil back on, though not as carefully as before. Jonah noticed the loose edge fluttering when she stepped onto the porch. She carried herself with pride, but her eyes searched the horizon as though expecting judgment to ride in with the morning light. And perhaps it would. By mid-afternoon, the dust cloud announced riders on the trail. Buck Mercer came at the head of a small group, his grin wide and poisonous. He reined in at the gate of the Double H Ranch, calling out loud enough for the cattle in the pasture to hear. "Hail, I've come to collect what's mine. $300 in the truth of your black widow." His men laughed, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Jonah walked from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, his axe still in hand. He didn't hurry. Every step was measured, steady, his shadow long across the yard. "You'll get your money," he said flatly, but nothing more. Buck smirked. "Then let's see her. The town's waiting. A wager's a wager. Don't tell me you've gone soft." Eliza appeared in the doorway before Jonah could stop her. She stood tall despite the tremor in her hands, the veil pulled tight. Her voice carried clear, though her chest rose and fell like a bird caught in a storm. "Mr. Mercer, you paid to see a spectacle, but I am not yours to claim. My life, my scars, my losses, they are not currency for your amusement." Buck's grin faltered. The men behind him muttered, glancing at one another. Jonah stepped closer to the gate, his eyes locked on Mercer. "She speaks true. You wagered against me and I lost. Take your money and be gone." He pulled a pouch from his coat, heavy with coin, and tossed it into the dirt at Buck's horse's feet. The sound rang louder than it should have, like judgment struck. Buck's smile twisted. So the great Jonah Hale admits defeat. All for a woman no one else would touch. Jonah's axe bit into the dirt beside his boot, the handle quivering under his grip. "Say another word against her, and you won't leave this ranch standing." For a long moment the yard held its breath. Buck's grin wavered, his bravado tested by the steel in Jonah's eyes. Finally he spat into the dust, scooped the pouch from the ground, and turned his horse. "Enjoy your miracle, Hale," he sneered, though the edge of his voice betrayed something brittle. His men followed, their laughter hollow as they rode back toward town. Silence returned, broken only by the wind through the grass. Eliza stepped down from the porch, her veil trembling in the breeze. "You paid for my dignity?" she whispered, her voice thick with something Jonah could not name. He shook his head. "No. I paid to end a game I should never have played. Your dignity was never for sale." Her hands clutched the black fabric at her throat. For the first time, Jonah saw a crack in the wall of sorrow she had built around herself. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the faintest trace of relief, like the first light piercing a storm cloud. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jonah found her in the garden again. She stood among the rows of late autumn herbs, veil discarded on the fence post. Her scarred face lifted toward the fading light. He watched her for a long time before stepping closer. "You don't need the veil here," he said softly. Eliza turned, her eyes catching the fire of the setting sun. "Perhaps, but the world beyond this ranch won't be so kind." Jonah's jaw tightened. "Then let the world stay beyond these fences. What matters is here." She studied him as though testing the truth of his words. And in the quiet that followed, Jonah realized something he hadn't wanted to admit. The bet that had started in pride had led him to a crossroads. Eliza Warren was no game, no burden, no secret to be hidden. She was the beginning of something that could either break him or save him. And he knew deep in the marrow of his bones he was willing to risk everything to find out which it would be. The next morning, the town of Redemption Creek stirred with whispers sharper than knives. Buck Mercer's story spread faster than prairie fire. He told anyone who would listen that Jonah Hale had bought the veiled widow, lost the bet, and paid dearly to hide whatever horror she concealed beneath her black cloth. Some men laughed, others shook their heads, and the women whispered behind their hands. By noon, the saloon was swollen with gossip, each retelling darker than the last. Jonah knew the rumors before he reached town. Tom Brennan had ridden out to warn him, his face grim beneath his hat. "They're turning it into a show," Tom said. "They say Eliza's cursed. They say you've lost your mind protecting her. Some even claim she bewitched you." Jonah had listened in silence. His jaw set, then saddled his horse and rode hard toward Redemption Creek. When he stepped into the saloon, the room fell to a hush. Cards stilled. Mugs hovered halfway to lips, and every eye turned to him. Buck Mercer leaned against the bar, grinning wide, his cronies flanking him like shadows. "Hail," he drawled. "Come to defend your phantom bride." The men chuckled low and cruel. Jonah crossed the floor with the steady weight of a man who would not bend. I came to end your lies, he said. His voice carried clear, steady cutting through the smoke like a blade. You made a bet to humiliate a woman already broken by fire and loss. You wagered on shame, Mercer, and I paid to end your spectacle. But you will not drag her name through the mud of your drunken mouth. Buck's grin faltered. Big words hail. But the town deserves the truth. He slammed his fist on the bar. Take off her veil. Show them what you're protecting. Let them see what their great Jonah Hale paid for. The room buzzed, men leaning forward, eager for the show. Jonah's stomach turned. He knew Eliza's scars were not theirs to judge, not theirs to feast upon. He opened his mouth to speak, but a voice cut through the crowd before he could. No one will strip me again, Eliza said. She stood in the doorway, her black veil gone, her face bare in the dusty light. Gasps rippled through the room, some recoiling, others staring with wide, stunned eyes. The fire had marked her skin, but her posture was unbroken, her eyes fierce. This is who I am. This is what the fire left me. If you wish to mock me, do it openly. But do not mock the man who stood when all of you turned away. The silence was suffocating. Even the judge nursing whiskey in the corner looked down at his glass as if ashamed. Buck's grin twisted, but it no longer carried the same weight. He muttered something under his breath, then shoved away from the bar, pushing through the door into the street. His cronies followed their laughter, thin and hollow. Eliza's hands trembled, but her voice did not break. I will not live in shadows for your comfort, she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. My scars are not shame, they are survival. She turned, walking back toward the street, the sun catching her hair where fire had spared it. Jonah followed her outside, his chest burning with something fiercer than anger, pride. She had faced them, all of them, and not crumbled. He caught up to her near the horses, his hand brushing her arm. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. I did, Eliza replied, her eyes still wet but shining. If I hide, they win. If I stand, at least the truth is mine. Jonah looked at her, then truly looked and felt the ground shift beneath him. She was not the burden he had feared, or the shame Buck had promised. She was fire that had refused to be consumed, steel hammered by loss, but unbroken. As they rode back toward the Double H Ranch, the prairie winds strong in their faces, Jonah knew the fight was not over. The town would not forget. Some would whisper curses, others would call it madness. But he also knew one thing with the certainty of stone. He would stand beside her no matter what storm Redemption Creek tried to bring. The ride back from Redemption Creek was quiet, but the silence carried a weight heavier than words. Eliza kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her shoulders squared, though Jonah saw the tremor in her hands where they gripped the reins. The town had seen her scars. Some had turned away in pity, others in disgust. Jonah's chest tightened at the thought, but Eliza's voice still echoed in his mind. My scars are not shame, they are survival. She had faced them down with a courage that stripped the crowd bare of its cruelty, and yet he knew that courage came at a cost. When they reached the Double H Ranch, the cattle stirred restlessly as if the land itself sensed unease. Tom Brennan was waiting on the porch, his hat in his hands. Trouble's brewing, he warned. Buck Mercer's not finished. He left town riled, swore he'd settle it out here. Folks say he's been gathering men with more loyalty to his whiskey than to the law. Jonah's jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Eliza stepped forward. Then let him come, she said. Her voice was steady, though her eyes glimmered in the lantern light. He feeds on fear. We give him none. He loses his power. Tom stared at her, surprised, then nodded slowly. She's right, but we best be ready all the same. The following days were a blur of preparation. Fences were reinforced, rifles cleaned, and neighbors quietly sent word they would stand with Jonah if Mercer tried to bring violence to his land. Some came with wagons, others with nothing more than steady hands and loyal hearts. Eliza worked beside them, her veil discarded now, scars bared without apology. She cooked meals for the men, carried water, and tended to the smaller chores no one else noticed. Jonah watched her move through the ranch with quiet determination, her presence weaving strength into the very walls. But at night when the house was quiet, Jonah sometimes heard her sobs muffled through the thin wooden walls. She thought him asleep, but he lay awake, his fists clenched, torn between giving her the space she needed and going to her. One night he rose, walked to her door, and knocked softly. Silence, then her voice hoarse and broken. Please, not tonight. He stood there a long moment before turning away, the ache in his chest sharper than any wound. On the fourth day, riders appeared on the ridge. Jonah spotted them from the porch, his eyes narrowing. Buck Mercer at the front, flanked by half a dozen rough men, with rifles slung careless across their saddles. Dust billowed around them as they rode down into the valley toward the Double H Ranch. The cattle stirred, lowing nervously, sensing the storm. Jonah saddled his horse and rode out to meet them at the edge of the pasture. Tom followed, rifle across his lap. Eliza stood on the porch, her black dress whipping in the wind, watching with eyes that burned like embers. Buck reined in his horse, grinning wide. "Hail," he called, voice thick with liquor. "You made a fool of me in town. Now I've come to take what's mine. Hand over the widow and we'll leave your cattle in peace." Jonah's hand tightened on the reins. "She's not yours to take," he said. "She never was." Buck's grin twisted. "Then I'll burn this ranch to the ground and salt the earth before I let you keep her." He raised his hand and his men shifted rifles, catching the sun. Jonah's voice dropped low and steady. "You bring fire here, Mercer, and you'll find this land fights back harder than you've ever known." Behind him, the creak of wagon wheels and the murmur of voices carried across the yard. Neighbors arriving, rifles in hand, standing quietly at the fence line. The odds had shifted. Buck saw it too, his grin faltering, but pride held him in place. Then Eliza stepped down from the porch, her scarred face unhidden, her voice cutting across the prairie. "You think to scare me with fire, Buck? Mercer, I have already lived through flames that took my husband and child. You cannot burn me again. You cannot shame me again. You are nothing but smoke." Her words fell like stones in the silence. Even Mercer's men shifted uneasily, some glancing at each other with doubt. Buck snarled, his hand tightening on his rifle. But Jonah was already moving his horse, stepping forward, his eyes locked on the man who had turned cruelty into sport. The standoff hung sharp and dangerous, the prairie holding its breath, waiting for the first spark to fall. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Buck Mercer's hand lingered too long on the stock of his rifle, his grin more a snarl than a smile. Jonah felt the weight of the land pressing against his shoulders, the silence taut like a rope about to snap. Neighbors lined the fence line, their rifles steady but their faces tense. Eliza stood at the porch, her scarred face bared to the wind, her eyes locked on Buck with a fire that even the flames of her past could not extinguish. "Last chance." Hale, Buck spat, his voice carrying across the yard. "Hand her over and save your cattle, else I'll leave nothing standing but ashes." Jonah's reply came slow, deliberate, heavy with iron. "You'll get nothing from me. Not her, not this land. You want to fight, Mercer, you'll have it." Buck's grin twisted cruel. "So be it." He raised his hand and the crack of a rifle split the air. Dirt kicked up near Jonah's horse's hooves, the animal snorting and stamping. The first spark had fallen and the rope of silence snapped. Gunfire erupted, sharp and brutal, echoing across the valley. Jonah wheeled his horse, drawing his revolver in a fluid motion, honed by years of necessity. He fired once, twice, driving Mercer's men scrambling for cover behind their horses. Tom Brennan shouted, his rifle barking from the porch rail, neighbors answering with steady shots that cut through the smoke. Eliza ran inside the house, not to hide but to fetch the rifle Jonah had left above the mantel. Her hands trembled as she loaded the weapon, but when she stepped back onto the porch, her aim was steady. She fired into the air first, the sound sharp, commanding. "This is not your land, Buck Mercer. It is not your fight to win." Mercer's men faltered, their confidence thinning as bullets struck close. Two broke ranks, entirely spurring their horses and fleeing across the fields. The others exchanged glances, doubt gnawing at them. Buck roared curses, trying to hold them together, but the tide was turning. Jonah rode hard toward Buck, his revolver trained steady. Mercer fired back the shot, grazing Jonah's arm, burning like fire but not slowing him. He closed the distance, his horse slamming against Mercer's mount. The two men colliding in a fury of fists and rage. The guns fell to the dirt as their hands grappled, each strike fueled by pride and years of bitter rivalry. Buck was strong, his shoulders thick from years of barroom brawls, but Jonah fought with something deeper. He fought with the weight of his land, with the memory of Eliza's trembling voice, with the fire that had scarred her, but left her unbroken. He would not lose her to cruelty, would not see his ranch fall to smoke. They crashed to the ground, rolling in dust and blood. Mercer's fist split Jonah's lip, but Jonah answered with a blow that sent the man reeling. Neighbors shouted, cattle bellowed, and the thunder of hooves carried as men loyal to the ranch surged forward. Eliza lowered her rifle, her heart pounding. She could see Jonah straddling buck fists raised for the final strike. "Jonah!" she cried, her voice sharp as a whip. He froze his chest, heaving eyes blazing with rage. "Don't," she pleaded. "If you end him here, you let him turn you into the monster he already is. Let the man live with his shame." Jonah's fist trembled in the air. For a long moment he stared down at Mercer. His rival's sneer cracked and bloody. Then with a growl he dropped his hand and shoved himself to his feet. "You're finished, Mercer," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Set foot on this land again, and you won't walk away." Buck staggered to his knees, spitting blood into the dust. His men had already fled, leaving him alone under the weight of the town's judgment. He glared at Eliza, then at Jonah, but there was no fight left in him. With a stumble, he mounted his horse and rode into the horizon, his shadow shrinking with the dusk. The yard fell silent except for the ragged breathing of men who had braced for death. Neighbors lowered their rifles, relief settling heavy across their shoulders. Tom Brennan stepped forward, clapping Jonah on the back. "You held," he said simply. Jonah turned his gaze, finding Eliza on the porch. She still held the rifle, her scarred face wet with tears, her body trembling from the strain of courage. He walked to her slowly, each step echoing with the weight of what they had endured. "You saved me," Jonah said quietly. "You saved us both." Eliza shook her head. "No, Jonah. You saved yourself. You chose to stand not for pride, but for what was right. That is the only victory worth keeping." The prairie wind swept between them, carrying away the smoke, the blood, and the echoes of gunfire. What remained was silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of survival of a storm weathered together. The dust of the fight lingered for days, hanging over the valley like smoke that refused to lift. Neighbors drifted back to their own lands, some shaking Jonah's hand, others offering stiff nods, but all carrying the story of what had happened at the Double H Ranch. Word spread across Redemption Creek faster than fire in summer grass. Some said Jonah Hale had gone mad, risking his life for a scarred widow no other man would claim. Others whispered that Eliza Warren was a witch, her scars proof of curses best left untouched. But there were a few quiet voices in the crowd who spoke of her courage, of the way she had faced Mercer and shamed him before the town. Jonah heard all of it. He rode into town once, 2 days after the fight, and felt the weight of eyes follow him down Main Street. The judge nodded stiffly from the porch of the courthouse, while Buck's men slunk away like dogs nursing wounds. No one dared challenge him outright, but the whispers cut deep. He bought supplies quickly and left the murmurs following him like shadows. Back at the ranch, life demanded attention. Fences torn during the fight had to be mended, cattle driven back into order, and men reassured that Mercer's threats would not return. Eliza worked beside them, never hiding her face now. Her scars caught the sun, a reminder of what she had endured. And though some men struggled to meet her eyes at first, they found respect in her steady presence. She cooked meals for the workers, stitched torn shirts, and even stood guard with a rifle during long nights when fear of Mercer's return still lingered. Yet in the quiet hours, the weight pressed heavy on her. Jonah found her one evening sitting on the porch staring out at the fading light, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. He sat beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. For a long time neither spoke. The prairie stretched wide before them, endless and silent. "They'll never see me as more than scars," Eliza said finally, her voice brittle. "To them I will always be the woman burned by fire, bought by a bet." Jonah turned his gaze to her, his jaw tight. "To them maybe, but not to me." Her eyes flicked toward him, gray and searching. "Why not?" He drew a long breath, the words slow and heavy. "Because I've seen men with perfect faces carry rot in their souls. I've seen strong backs break at the first sign of hardship. But you faced fire, you faced shame, and you still stand. That's more than most could ever claim." Her lips trembled, and for the first time since the night she unveiled herself, tears slid freely down her cheeks. Jonah reached out his hand, hovering before settling gently on hers. She did not pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand with a desperate strength, as if anchoring herself to something real. Days turned into weeks, and though Mercer never returned, his absence did not erase the unease. The town remained divided, half pitying Jonah for wasting his pride on a ruined woman, half respecting him for standing his ground. Liza bore their stares when she ventured into Redemption Creek. Her chin lifted, though her heart ached. Jonah never left her side, his presence a shield she had not asked for, but could not deny. One evening, as winter crept closer and the air grew sharp with frost, Jonah found Eliza in the barn. She was tending to a newborn calf, its thin body trembling in the straw. She moved with surprising gentleness, murmuring soft words as she rubbed it dry with a cloth. Jonah watched from the doorway, something stirring in him he had long buried. The sight of her scars softened by lantern light, her voice tender, despite all the harshness she had endured, struck him deeper than any bullet. When she noticed him, she straightened, brushing straw from her dress. "It survived," she said simply. "Because you cared for it," Jonah replied. His voice was low, almost rough. "Everything you touch seems to survive." The words hung between them, heavier than they seemed. Eliza's breath caught, and for the first time her eyes did not turn away from his. That night, sitting by the hearth, Jonah carved a small piece of wood, his knife steady, despite the memories of blood and smoke still fresh. When he finished, he handed it to her. It was a wolf, small and simple, but its stance proud. "For you," he said, "a reminder you are not prey. You never were." Eliza cradled the carving in her hands, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. And in that moment, something shifted. The scars were still there, the whispers still sharp, but between them a fragile trust had begun to grow, fragile, but strong enough to weather the prairie winds. Winter crept over the land with a quiet ferocity, blanketing the wide prairie in white, impressing its cold fingers into every corner of the ranch. Fences vanished beneath drifts. Cattle huddled close for warmth, and nights stretched long and heavy with silence. Jonah and Eliza found themselves bound together by necessity, sharing the same hearth, the same table, and the same endless hours of waiting out the storm season. At first, the quiet between them was awkward, filled with unsaid words and the faint echo of old wounds. Jonah busied himself with work that needed doing, splitting logs, mending tack, tending to the animals that required constant care in the biting cold. Eliza moved through the house with quiet efficiency, cooking hearty meals from dwindling supplies, patching blankets, and keeping the fire alive. Though they rarely spoke more than a handful of words at a time, each glance carried something heavier than silence, something that hinted at a bond forming beneath the frost. One night when the wind howled loud enough to shake the shutters, Jonah found Eliza standing at the window, her scarred face illuminated by firelight. She was staring out into the storm, her hands pressed against the cold glass. He stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his boots. "Storms pass," he said quietly. She turned her gray eyes, searching his face. "Do they?" Her voice cracked, filled with more than the weather. Jonah hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Not all. But some do. And when they do, they leave the land cleaner, sharper, ready to grow again." He didn't know if his words comforted her, but her shoulders softened and she let the curtain fall closed. That night when the fire burned low, Jonah laid an extra blanket across her shoulders where she slept in the chair by the hearth. She stirred but did not wake, and he let himself watch her for a moment longer than he should have, his heart aching with something he refused to name. Days blurred into weeks. Outside, the snow piled higher. Inside, a fragile rhythm grew. Eliza began humming as she cooked soft tunes that reminded Jonah of a life he thought he had forgotten. He caught himself listening, the sound warming something deep in his chest. One evening she laughed, sudden and unguarded, when a calf in the barn nipped at her skirt. The sound startled them both. She covered her mouth as though she had committed a sin, but Jonah only smiled, the rare curve of his lips breaking the mask of his usual sternness. "Don't hide that," he said. "The world's cold enough. Let it hear you." Her eyes glistened, and though she said nothing, she did not cover her mouth the next time laughter escaped her. But with the thaw of trust came the return of shadows. Eliza woke some nights, screaming, her body slick with sweat, her voice calling names Jonah did not know. He would rush to her side, finding her clutching her scars as though trying to rip them away. "It's gone," he would murmur. "The fire's gone." Sometimes she believed him, sinking into his arms until sleep returned. Sometimes she pushed him away, retreating to the corner of the room, ashamed of her weakness. Jonah bore it all with patience, though each cry tore at him like barbed wire. He had never wanted complication, never thought himself capable of tenderness. But Eliza's pain cracked something inside him, forcing him to admit that beneath the layers of pride and solitude, his heart had been waiting for someone who saw him not as a rancher or a landowner, but as a man. One evening after a particularly harsh storm, they sat by the fire with mugs of coffee, the silence comfortable for once. Eliza traced the rim of her cup with a finger, then looked at him. "Why do you stay near me?" she asked softly. "The town thinks me cursed. Mercer called me ruined. Even you. You bought me because of a bet." Her voice trembled at the last words, though her eyes held steady. Jonah set down his cup, his hands rough and scarred from years of work. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "A man's pride is a dangerous thing, but I've paid for it, and I'll keep paying if I must. Not because of shame, but because of what I've found since. You." The word hung in the air, simple but heavier than the storm outside. Eliza's breath caught her scars shifting as her lips parted. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do," Jonah said. "I see you, Eliza. Not the scars, not the fire, not the whispers. You." Tears filled her eyes, and for once she did not turn away. She reached across the table, her hand trembling, and placed it over his. His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. In the silence that followed, the storm outside still raged, but within the walls of the Double H Ranch, another storm had quieted. For the first time, Jonah allowed himself to believe that love, fragile, scarred, and unexpected, was possible again. And for the first time, Eliza let herself believe that she was more than what the fire had left behind. Spring crept slowly across the prairie, melting the last of winter's ice and coaxing green shoots from the stubborn earth. Streams swelled with snowmelt, cattle lifted their heads to graze on fresh grass, and the air carried a softness Jonah hadn't felt in years. The Double H Ranch, once shadowed by storms and whispers, began to breathe easier. Yet the quiet within its walls was more profound than the change outside. Jonah and Eliza had built a rhythm through the long winter, and now with the thaw came the question of what that rhythm truly meant. In town, Redemption Creek still murmured with gossip, but the sharpness of the whispers had dulled. Men who had once sneered at Jonah now tipped their hats, some out of respect, others out of fear after Mercer's humiliating defeat. Women watched Eliza when she came to market, their stares a mix of pity, curiosity, and something more complicated, an acknowledgement of her defiance. No one called her cursed aloud anymore. Perhaps it was because she met every stare head-on, unflinching, her scars no longer hidden. Perhaps it was because Jonah walked at her side, a silent warning to those who might test her strength. Buck Mercer had not been seen since that day. Rumors placed him far south. Others claimed he drank himself into ruin. No one seemed to know, and no one cared to ask. Without his shadow looming, the ranch found peace. But peace carried its own questions. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of gold and purple, Jonah sat on the porch carving wood with his steady hands. Eliza joined him, carrying a basket of herbs she had planted weeks before. She settled into the chair beside him, her movements graceful despite the stiffness that lingered from old wounds. For a while they sat in silence, the only sound the rasp of the knife against wood. Finally Eliza spoke. "I used to think my life ended the night of the fire," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Everything, I was burned away with them, my husband, my child, even my name. I thought all that was left of me was ruin." She turned her gaze to him, her gray eyes clear despite the scars framing them. "But here I am, still breathing, still standing, and somehow beginning again." Jonah set down the carving, a small horse taking shape in the wood. "Fire destroys," he said, "but it also clears the ground for new growth. I've seen fields blackened one year, come back greener the next. Maybe we're the same." Her lips curved, faint but real. "Do you believe that?" He nodded slowly. "I do, because I've watched you. You're stronger than this land, Eliza, and it's the strongest land I know." Her hand trembled as she reached for his, resting lightly atop it. "And you, Jonah Hale, what of you? You've lived years with nothing but your pride to keep you company. What do you believe you deserve now?" Jonah hesitated, the weight of years pressing against his chest. He had been many things: a rancher, a fighter, a man feared more than loved. But as he looked at her, scarred and unyielding, he realized what he wanted had nothing to do with land or cattle. "I deserve this," he said simply, "sitting beside you, knowing that tomorrow and the day after you'll still be here. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. And if the town never accepts me, then let the town rot, he replied, his voice firm. This ranch, this land, this life, we'll build it together. Their words can't touch what's ours. The setting sun painted her scars in gold, softening them, until Jonah saw not the pain of the past, but the promise of what lay ahead. She squeezed his hand, her strength steady, her voice a whisper. Then I will stay. The weeks that followed carried proof of that promise. Eliza planted a larger garden near the house, filling it with herbs, beans, and flowers that brightened the ranch with unexpected color. She laughed more often, a sound that eased the hardness in Jonah's chest each time he heard it. Neighbors began to stop by, some bringing seeds, others lending tools, their visits less about gossip and more about quiet acceptance. The scars that once drew stares now marked her as something else entirely, a woman who had faced fire and returned unbroken. Jonah carved a final figure one evening, a wolf standing tall, its head lifted toward the sky. He placed it on the mantle beside the earlier carvings. For us, he said when Eliza asked, a reminder we survived the fire, the storm, the bet, and the shame, and we'll survive whatever comes next. She touched the carving, her fingers lingering over the grain. A pack, she whispered, not alone. Jonah smiled, rare and unguarded, never alone again. As spring settled fully across the prairie, the Double H Ranch stood not just as a mark of one man's pride, but as the beginning of a shared life. Jonah Hale, once hardened by solitude, had found his equal in a woman scarred, but unbroken. Eliza Warren, once consumed by grief, had found a place where her scars were not chains, but proof of survival. And when the coyotes howled at night, their cries echoing across the wide-open land, the two of them sat side by the fire, their silence no longer heavy with sorrow, but light with the quiet certainty of belonging. Sometimes the West was not just about land or cattle, but about the people who carried scars the world could not see. Jonah and Eliza remind us that survival is more than breathing. It is choosing to stand, choosing to trust, and daring to love again, even when the world whispers against you. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please leave a comment below, telling us where you're watching from, and share if you've ever seen strength grow from pain. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West stories filled with courage, resilience, and unexpected love.